this episode, we are stepping into a topic that can feel overwhelming at first because the modern threat environment changes fast and is often described in dramatic language. For a new learner, the most important thing to understand is that the current cyber threat landscape is not just a list of scary attacks. It is a living picture of who is attacking, what they are targeting, how they are doing it, and why certain methods keep rising while others fade into the background. Security managers need this picture because they cannot protect everything equally, and they cannot make smart decisions if they treat every threat as the same. A good view of the landscape helps people separate hype from real risk. It also helps them understand why some threats dominate boardroom discussions, why certain controls matter more than others, and why attackers often succeed through ordinary weaknesses rather than through movie-style technical genius. The goal here is to make the landscape feel understandable, organized, and useful instead of chaotic. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A threat landscape is best understood as the overall environment of risks that organizations face from malicious activity, harmful mistakes, and evolving attack methods. It includes the kinds of attackers that are active, the common techniques they use, the technologies they target, and the business conditions that make certain victims more attractive. That matters because cyber threats do not exist in isolation. A phishing campaign becomes more dangerous when a company relies heavily on email for approvals, when users are rushed, or when identity controls are weak. A cloud exposure becomes more serious when important data is widely distributed and nobody is fully accountable for how it is protected. The word current matters here because the landscape is shaped by what is practical for attackers right now. Threats rise when they are profitable, easy to repeat, hard to detect, or likely to pressure victims into fast decisions. Looking at the landscape this way keeps beginners from treating cybersecurity as a random collection of separate news stories and helps them see the patterns underneath. One of the clearest ways to understand today's landscape is to look at the different kinds of threat actors and what drives them. Cybercriminals usually want money, which means they focus on methods that scale well and create pressure quickly, such as fraud, extortion, and credential theft. Nation-state groups may have very different goals, including espionage, long-term access, disruption, or influence, and they may show more patience because their objectives are strategic rather than purely financial. Hacktivists can be motivated by ideology, politics, or publicity, and their actions may focus as much on embarrassment and visibility as on deep technical impact. Insider threats come from people who already have some level of access, whether their actions are malicious, careless, or simply uninformed. Opportunistic attackers sit somewhere else in the picture because they are not always choosing a victim for a special reason. They are often scanning widely for exposed systems, weak passwords, or easy openings, which means many organizations are targeted simply because they are reachable and vulnerable. Among all current threats, social engineering remains one of the most important because it targets human judgment rather than only technical systems. Phishing is still common because it works, especially when attackers make their messages look routine, urgent, or tied to real business activity. Instead of trying to break through every technical barrier, an attacker may simply trick a user into clicking a link, opening a document, sharing a code, or approving a request that looks legitimate. Business email compromise, BEC, is a good example of how damaging this can be because the attacker may not need malware at all. If a criminal can impersonate a trusted executive, vendor, or coworker convincingly enough, money can be transferred, data can be exposed, or a fraudulent process can begin before anyone realizes what happened. Social engineering remains powerful because it adapts to human habits. People are busy, they trust familiar workflows, and they often respond quickly to messages that appear connected to finance, leadership, customer service, or technical support. Closely connected to social engineering is the rise of identity-focused attacks, which have become central to the modern threat landscape. Attackers know that if they can gain access to a valid account, they may avoid many of the alarms that trigger when malware or obvious system abuse appears. A stolen identity can give them entry into email, cloud services, file storage, collaboration tools, and administrative systems without forcing them to break in the old-fashioned way. Multi-factor authentication, MFA, has improved security in many environments, but attackers have adapted by stealing session information, flooding users with approval requests, using convincing fake login pages, or targeting support processes that allow account recovery. This matters because identity is now the doorway to much of the business. When an account is trusted, the attacker may be able to move quietly, read sensitive messages, reset credentials, or create persistence without drawing immediate attention. That is why modern security discussions spend so much time on access control, user behavior, and identity monitoring rather than focusing only on perimeter defenses. Ransomware continues to shape the threat environment because it combines technical disruption with intense business pressure. In simple terms, ransomware is malicious software that locks or disrupts access to systems or data and then demands payment. But the current version of this threat is broader than that basic description. Many attackers now steal data before encryption and threaten to leak it if the victim refuses to pay, which turns a system outage into a privacy, legal, and reputational crisis as well. Some groups also target backup environments, identity systems, and management tools first because they know recovery becomes harder when the organization loses visibility and control at the same time. This threat is effective not just because of the code involved, but because it attacks the victim's ability to operate. If payroll stops, customer service fails, clinical systems are disrupted, or manufacturing halts, leadership may feel enormous pressure to respond quickly. Ransomware remains a major concern because it turns technical weakness into business pain in a very direct and immediate way. Another major feature of the current landscape is the speed with which attackers exploit known weaknesses. People sometimes assume the biggest danger always comes from rare and mysterious flaws, but many successful attacks begin with vulnerabilities that were already known and fixable. Attackers scan the internet constantly for exposed services, outdated software, weak configurations, and forgotten systems that have fallen outside normal oversight. Once they find an opening, they often move fast because they know defenders may not yet have patched the issue or may not even realize the asset is reachable. This is why vulnerability management is not just a technical housekeeping task. It is deeply tied to threat awareness, asset visibility, and operational discipline. Zero-day vulnerabilities get a lot of attention because they are new and dramatic, but known weaknesses often create just as much damage when organizations are slow to identify what they own, slow to patch critical systems, or unable to separate important exposures from minor ones. The landscape rewards attackers who can automate discovery and punishes defenders who lack consistency. The growth of cloud services has changed the threat landscape by shifting where data lives, how systems connect, and what access really means. Instead of attacking only traditional data centers, criminals now look for exposed storage, weak permissions, overly broad administrative roles, and insecure connections between services. A misconfiguration in a cloud platform can create serious risk even when no complex exploit is involved, because the weakness may already expose data or grant too much access to the wrong identity. Application Programming Interface, API, security also matters more now because organizations rely heavily on automated connections between systems, partners, apps, and services. If those connections are poorly designed or weakly protected, attackers may abuse them to pull data, impersonate users, or bypass controls that work well in the normal user interface. This part of the landscape reminds beginners that cyber risk follows business change. As organizations move faster, connect more systems, and store more information across distributed environments, security has to track those changes closely or blind spots begin to grow. Third-party and supply chain risk also deserve attention because modern organizations rarely operate alone. They depend on vendors, cloud providers, software components, service partners, consultants, and outside platforms to keep critical work moving. Each one of those relationships can create value, but each one can also introduce exposure that the organization does not fully control. If a trusted provider is compromised, if a software update carries malicious code, or if a partner has weak security practices, the damage can spread into the customer environment in ways that are hard to predict. This makes the threat landscape more interconnected than it used to be. An organization may be harmed not because it failed internally, but because it trusted a dependency that became the attacker's path inward. That is why modern security leaders think beyond their own walls. They ask how vendors are governed, what data third parties can access, how dependencies are monitored, and what would happen if a supposedly trusted relationship suddenly became a source of disruption, data loss, or unauthorized access. Insider activity remains an important part of the landscape, even though it receives less dramatic attention than ransomware or nation-state operations. An insider threat does not always look like a hostile employee stealing data on the way out the door, though that can happen. More often, the problem is a person with legitimate access making poor decisions, mishandling sensitive information, bypassing a process for convenience, or failing to recognize that a request is suspicious. Current threats often succeed because the line between external and internal risk is not as clear as people expect. A criminal who steals an employee's account is suddenly acting through a trusted identity. A rushed worker who uploads data to an unsanctioned service may create exposure without intending harm. A frustrated administrator with broad permissions may be able to cause outsized damage if oversight is weak. This is why mature organizations treat insider risk as a matter of behavior, access design, culture, and monitoring, not just as a problem of catching bad people after the fact. The role of automation has also grown in the modern threat landscape, and that changes the scale of what attackers can do. Criminal groups no longer need to perform every step manually when tools can scan for targets, test stolen credentials, generate fake messages, or package common attack methods into reusable kits. That makes cybercrime more accessible to less sophisticated actors and allows more advanced groups to move faster across larger numbers of potential victims. Artificial intelligence, AI, adds another layer to this picture, not because it magically creates unbeatable attacks, but because it can help produce more convincing content, faster research, and more adaptive targeting. Attackers can use automation to personalize lures, sort stolen data, and refine social engineering at a speed that was harder to achieve before. At the same time, business dependence on digital systems makes all of this more painful. Organizations rely on technology for communication, payment, operations, and customer service, so even a common attack can ripple across many areas quickly. Attackers benefit whenever businesses become more connected and more dependent on always available services without improving security discipline at the same pace. For a beginner, one of the best responses to all of this is to stop thinking about threats as isolated technical events and start viewing them as patterns that exploit value, trust, and weakness. Attackers generally go where the reward is high and the resistance is manageable. They target money, identities, sensitive information, business interruption, and relationships that can be abused for access or leverage. That means defenders need to understand what matters most to their own organization before trying to react to every threat headline. A hospital, a bank, a manufacturer, and a small professional services firm may all face phishing and ransomware, but the business consequences and most important priorities can be very different. Threat awareness becomes useful only when it is connected to business context. Without that connection, organizations waste energy on noise, chase trends that do not matter much to them, and miss the ordinary weaknesses that attackers are actually exploiting. A clear view of the landscape helps security managers focus their limited time and resources where they can make the biggest difference. That broader view also helps clear up several misconceptions that confuse new students. One common mistake is assuming the most dangerous threat is always the newest or most technically impressive one. In reality, many serious incidents still begin with familiar problems such as weak passwords, poor visibility, unpatched systems, excessive privileges, or users being tricked into trusting the wrong message. Another mistake is imagining that cyber threats mainly come from shadowy experts using rare techniques, when today's environment often includes organized criminal groups that behave more like businesses than lone hackers. There is also a tendency to think that if an organization is not famous, large, or politically important, it will not be targeted. That is not how much of the landscape works. Opportunistic attacks are widespread, and many victims are chosen because they are accessible, underprepared, or likely to pay under pressure. A better mindset is to assume that most organizations are exposed to common threats, and that preparedness matters more than prestige when it comes to reducing everyday cyber risk. By the end of this discussion, the current cyber threat landscape should feel less like a storm of random dangers and more like a set of connected pressures that follow money, access, data, and disruption. Social engineering remains powerful because people are busy and trust familiar workflows. Identity attacks matter because valid access opens doors quietly. Ransomware matters because it creates immediate business pain, while cloud risk, third-party exposure, insider behavior, and automated attack methods keep expanding the number of ways harm can occur. The most useful lesson for a new learner is that modern cybersecurity is not just about blocking malware. It is about understanding how attackers think, why certain business conditions create opportunity, and where ordinary weaknesses become serious. When you see the landscape in that broader way, security decisions start to make more sense. You can better understand why organizations care so much about access control, visibility, resilience, patching, vendor oversight, and user awareness, because all of them are responses to the same basic truth that current threats succeed where value is high and discipline is low.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.